So we actually have some barriers that are going to help us define different species. A reproductive barrier is anything that prevents individuals of closely related species. So maybe they are the same species, maybe they're not. We're going to use these reproductive barriers to define if they are, if they're not. They're going to prevent interbreeding. Okay, so the ability to breed with one another. So if an organism, or I should say two organisms, are showing this reproductive barrier, then they're different species. They don't have to meet all of them, just one of them. Then that's going to prevent them from being the same species. It's a barrier. Reproductive means, how are we defining that? They are labeled pre-zygotic barriers up here that I'm going to talk about, and then post-zygotic barriers. The reason zygotic is mentioned in there is that, remember, a zygote is formed when reproduction, I should say when fertilization is successful. So when sperm meets egg, we're talking about sexual reproduction. Sperm meets egg, a zygote has formed. If you are saying it is a pre-zygotic barrier, so that would be temporal, habitat, behavioral, mechanical, and gametic. Those are 5 pre-zygotic barriers. You're telling me the zygote hasn't formed yet. None of those barriers are met. Prevents them from being the same species. If you are talking about a post-zygotic barrier, that is after fertilization has happened and after the zygote has formed, so we have reproduction, we have mating, we have zygote formation, so fertilization, but we can actually have barriers after that attempt. Those are reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, and hybrid breakdown. So we'll talk about all those. If none of those barriers are met, pre-zygotic or post-zygotic, remember, just one of them has to be met in order to define it as a different species. If none of those are met, then we will have fertile, viable offspring being formed. Then these are members of the same species. So pre-zygotic barriers come up first. These barriers are going to occur before the zygote forms, so before sperm meets egg. So this can occur before mating even is available to these organisms, so before the actual attempt of sexual reproduction or fertilization between the species. First up is temporal isolation. So in temporal isolation, we're talking about time. Does mating occur in the spring for organisms? Does it occur in the fall for organisms? Depending on when these organisms want to mate, that's going to prevent them from mating if it's at a different time for their preference, their biological preference. So here I can actually see 2 different species of skunks. If I use that definition, if they look the same, yeah, they look pretty similar. Patterns are similar, color is similar, probably their behavioral is similar as well. Because they actually mate at different times of the year, they're different species. This is temporal isolation, a pre-zygotic barrier. The next type is habitat isolation. So living in different habitats, like those iguanas that I just mentioned in the previous slide, are going to prevent them from mating. Maybe one prefers dry land, maybe one prefers a marine environment, an aquatic environment. This is going to prevent mating from even occurring. So here I actually have 2 closely related species of garter snakes. Adaptation probably led to this habitat isolation pre-zygotic event. Adaptation is usually the answer for all these different isolation events, but we have species that resemble each other so much, but pre-zygotic barriers prevent them from being the same species. Behavioral isolation is another type, the last type of pre-zygotic barriers. Here I see these really cute blue-footed boobies. They mate only after a specific ritual, a mating ritual, occurs. If an organism looks like them but doesn't display that mating ritual, that event, that behavioral event, mating won't occur. So this is a behavioral isolation event. There's no sexual attraction between different populations. Okay, mating does happen. Let's say mating is attempted, but then we have a barrier that occurs after. Usually we're going to find these in plants. Okay, so mechanical isolation is the first one. And in mechanical isolation, this has to do with structural differences. Maybe there was a mating attempt. We had two organisms that were sexually attracted to each other and they tried to mate, but there is no mechanics working for them. They don't have the reproductive organs available to mate. So in this example here, I'm showing you the hummingbird feeding on this flower. So nice juicy nectar for that hummingbird, and the hummingbird will contribute to pollination event for this flower, this angiosperm, which I'll teach you guys, but the pollen is not transferable because the hummingbird bill, that's going to be covered with pollen because it just ate from this plant. It's not going to be able to fit in this one right here because of a mechanical difference. So mating will not occur between these two different flowers for that reason. They're different species. Gametic isolation is another type of prezygotic barrier, the last type, after mating has occurred. And okay, let's say that sexual attraction was there, mating attempt happened, and male gamete was able to fuse with female gamete, for instance, sperm and egg. What's going to happen is that the gamete will fail to unite successfully. So there is a meeting, but the uniting of that male and female gamete just doesn't occur. And so a zygote will not form if fertilization doesn't happen. These urchins are an example, red and purple. They will not fuse their gametes because they're different species. This has to do with proteins that are found on the surface of their eggs and sperm, so they're not able to bind to one another. This is called gametic isolation. They're different species. Okay, summary recap of prezygotic barriers. All right, what if the zygote does form? Mating happened, sexual attraction was there, we had the mechanical means to mate, the structures were available, time was available, habitat available, all those other things that we just talked about. And we have a successful fusion of male and female gametes coming together. A zygote has formed. Basically, what's going to happen is because they're different species, so if they are different species, they'll meet one of these three post-zygotic barriers. Number one, reduce hybrid viability. This is a nice fancy way of telling you guys that that offspring just won't be a successful adult. They're usually quite frail. The salamander is showing you that hybrid of two different species of salamander coming together. They don't develop fully. They're frail. They likely will not survive into sexual maturation and make offspring of their own. So they're usually going to die at quite an early age. This is called reduced hybrid viability. They will not reproduce since they don't reach sexual maturation. Okay, a very common example, let's say the organism does reach sexual maturation, but they are sterile. This is called reduced hybrid fertility. They are not able to leave offspring of their own. They are not fertile. A great example of this is a mule. A mule is the hybrid offspring of a horse and a donkey. Horse comes together with donkey, makes a mule. Mules are available all here in our world. They do not form offspring. They are very much sterile. Because the horse and the donkey coming together make a sterile offspring, even though the offspring is successful, that classifies them as different species. The horse is a different species from the donkey. The last one I want to talk about, and mainly contributed to plants, is hybrid breakdown. What hybrid breakdown is we see this viability of their offspring decrease over generations. And so we just have reproductive failure kind of appearing after the F2 generation. So we have parental F1, F2 with Mendelian genetics that I taught you. We start seeing a decrease in viability as generations go on. In incompatibility between the different species genes lead to this event in the offspring. I'm showing you some rice hybrids here that just no longer become viable after subsequent generations. This is called hybrid breakdown. It's a post-zygotic barrier that tells me that those original parents were different species.